Thanks for that, Fiona. Can I now invite Richard to take the floor from as the Chief Scientist from our Land and Water Challenge.
Kia ora koutou. Now, I make an apology for what I'm just going to do right now, but you know that movie Tag where a couple of guys do a silly bet and they do it for years and years and years? Well, I've been doing a bet with one David Holbrook, who's a research director at AgResearch for nearly 20 years, and it's on the outcome of a Chiefs versus Crusaders game, for which the winner gets a pie. Of course, I'm not going to embarrass him and bring a pie here, but the other thing that is part of that bet is that through gritted teeth, I hereby acknowledge the arse whooping that we got recently. So, now let's get on to the real stuff. I have another confession to make. Our Land and Water doesn't explicitly do research into greenhouse gas emissions. However, we are coming near the end of our tenure, as Anita kindly pointed out, so bugger that. Now, when you are on the farm, you are hit with a variety of different policies, and it is a real struggle to negotiate those. But it's also a real struggle to do that on a national level and test where all the trade-offs sit. So that's what we've tried to do. We've got to have a target, of course, though. So we've got to recognise a few facts. Our diets have shifted. I'm testament to that, or maybe it's just my age. And as a consequence of that, we have a few health issues that have popped up. We can grow a lot of food. Back of the envelope calculations say 40 million. We can grow a lot. But you know, what we grow is dictated by international markets. And you know, that's because we grow stuff really well that people want to pay for. But it means that there are imbalances in terms of what we need to import, resulting in both food insecurity for both children and adults. That adds up to about $14 billion annually in terms of a cost to our society. So our aim was to test a couple of policies. Highly productive land aside and biosecurity aside, we focused on obviously trying to meet climate and also trying to meet our freshwater focus, National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. We wanted to do that though while producing a healthy diet, one of our sister challenges told us what that was, and also maintaining an export sector because we needed to maintain profitability. So we have two foci here. The first one, climate focused, where we're focusing on changing land use within marginal land and some leaky land and land uses. And the second one is that where we recognise that there is an issue associated with freshwater, we're changing those land uses, and there's a co-benefit associated with greenhouse gases. Now, we focus purely on changing land use. We have not done anything with mitigation. There are steps in between there. There's a good rationale for that, and it's simply because we're not going to mitigate our way into good freshwater quality, and as it stands with the current policy. Now, we were given 185 different food groups from Healthier Lives that met requirements for calorific intake, macro micronutrients, amino acid profiles. So it's not meat-free, it's meatless, but not meat-free. We had to match those through to commodity crops that we currently grow and all their proxies. So that's what we've done. We also adjusted for losses associated with production, post-harvest handling and storage, packaging, processing, distribution, retail, consumption. A lot of losses, varying between 2 and 32%. We then had to say, okay, where are those grown? They're not just grown in monocultures, they're grown in rotations. So we had to adjust those land areas for those rotations, recognising that you will only grow one particular crop that you want in 1 year and hence would have to magnify that area. We've also looked at where those changes will occur. We recognise, obviously, GHG's climate change is global. Water quality tends to be local, and that means that change is likely to happen there first because that's where it's going to hit. What we've done is that we know what current land uses emit in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, a range of other attributes, importantly also their GHG profile, production and gross margin. We also know where water quality is under pressure from both nitrogen and phosphorus. We chose those because they happen to account for the majority of attributes in the National Policy Statement. So we know where the problem is. We also know where we can grow things. Anita mentioned land use suitability. That's a concept that we've been developing, taking into account the soil type, the rainfall, the temperature, the drainage. Where can you grow this? Which areas are suitable for this? But you've then got to import other constraints around infrastructure, constraints around the availability of labour. And then you've got to overlay that onto areas where those leaky land uses are likely to be. And that tells you where you can grow things. Of course, it's not the only step associated with that. And there's a bit of what I would just call mathematical jiggery-pokery. I can go into it in much finer detail of that, but essentially what it's doing is it's saying, okay, we have a parcel of land. We recognise that if it is susceptible to losses, then what land use are we going to replace it with? And what intensity of land use are we going to replace it with? Recognising that we want to maximise profitability. We don't want to compromise, though, losses associated to either water or to air. And hence, we have to bring in regionally specific cropping rotations, but those rotations also come with trade-offs, and they also come with emissions, which means that there's also the inclusion of other land uses like forestry, which have to buffer those. We recognise that we can't saturate the market, so it's not carte blanche. So we restrict it to having a maximum of 3 times current production. And as I mentioned, infrastructure restrictions as well. So, having said all that and giving a big build-up, here's the effect in terms of what happens. Now, this is just for pressure catchments, so these are the catchments where you likely have water quality issues. So the top is what we need to grow for a healthy diet should we choose to go down that avenue, including its proxies. We can grow more in areas where there is a freshwater issue, and that's just simply because there's more land available than if we were to substitute land that was just focused on a few areas around the margins and some very leaky and highly emitting land uses. This is just for the pressure catchments, but what it also recognises is that what you can't grow within catchments that are likely to be affected by water quality, you grow outside of it, and so you can eventually meet that national demand. Now, we're always asked in any sort of analysis that looks at this, recognising it is just a thought piece, what's the national picture and what's the effect? Well, this is what it looks like in terms of land use and gross margin. So these are both increases and decreases associated with certain types of land uses. Through meeting both the climate and freshwater focused scenarios and targets therein, there's going to be an increase in forestry, a little bit more with freshwater than with climate. Well, it's the doubling. You're going to have around a third more crop and horticultural land. It does come at a compromise, though, with the pastoral sectors. And you can see there, in terms of the values that we've calculated, that those numbers around 0.75 to 1.6 billion are quite significant for the pastoral sector. But overall, once you take that into account with gains in other sectors, the result varies between either a gain, that's on the climate side, or a $421 million loss on the freshwater side. Just to note that we have totalled up all these losses and assessed this in terms of what happens relative to today and also for these 2 particular scenarios. So under the nitrogen, phosphorus, GHG, and also gross margin, you are seeing quite significant changes, but the changes are greater under the freshwater focus scenario than they are under the climate scenario, both within areas where it's likely to change first and then nationally as well. And that would be, I guess, exemplified within those catchments for gross margin. Now, there are limitations to our analysis. It does use quite coarse data, you've got to recognise that, especially for the array of land use types and crops that we used, only around 30. We recognise there are more, and there are intensities or gradations within those, but they were all published and checked using acceptable models or observations. We may not have mapped our food groups, believe me, counting up the ingredients for 28 different types of bread through into commodity crops is bloody hard. But it was based on verified ingredients lists, and there was some processor input associated with that as well. We took a 20-year time horizon. Now, we recognise that there will be lags associated with implementation of any scenario. However, we would posit that that is enough time so that those lags are accounted for. Of course, our recommendation is that to improve the quality of these outputs, we do require more regionally focused inputs and analysis, and indeed we are doing that now in three additional catchments where we're going down to the level of including business cases for people to transition land uses if necessary. Just to wrap up some final key messages here, the first one that I wanted to draw your attention to is that the implications of putting in place freshwater policy cuts deeper and broader than it does in terms of our climate scenario. In fact, you would need an extra 14 to 26% reduction if you were to do it the other way around, i.e. just focusing on climate. Although there was an effect on gross margin, it's less than 1%, and with productivity gains, that can quickly be eroded to the point where it's negligible. We recognise, of course, that we have got forest, we have considered where it can grow. However, it's always the case that it's likely that there will be some areas where there is too much, and we've seen the consequences of that. I would also just note that I guess 20% of current plantings are actually in natives. And all this kind of adds up to the end story, which is if we were pursuing those two that climate and freshwater focus scenario and had that emphasis on growing what we needed to grow in order to have a healthy diet, there could possibly also be health benefits. So I'll end on that positive note. Got it.
Thanks, Richard. And as a one-eyed Cantabrian, thank you for the reminder that we got thrashed last week. But look, I think, that work that is really highlighting that, while we're here today to talk about greenhouse gases and climate change, water quality is also another really big driver of change ahead for us as farmers.